A pastor friend of mine was invited to fly to a fancy LA hotel to officiate the wedding of some friends. He is an African-American Lutheran pastor with an impressive portfolio in the ELCA at national as well as local level. It was the wedding of some of his high-level white friends. After the glittering ceremony, this pastor left the hall at the top and made his way to the bottom and stood on the curb for the valet to bring back his car. As he stood there, a very fancy car drove up, and a flashy man got out of the car, took his keys and attempted to give it to this pastor, saying, "My man, look after this car, it's expensive." I mean, what would a well-dressed man be doing standing on the curb of a hotel that's mostly frequented by elite white people? He has to be a valet attendant. This pastor described it as like going literally from high heights to even below the ground. His hopes for a new reality were dashed. His pride was crushed. He was, to say the least, mischaracterized. Nothing was even more. He was being minimalized. Difference. He was being made less than he was. The pastor told a story in a synod group that I had co-founded in another synod, not our synod, to address racism in the church. I had also told my stories, like I told you last week, about the 7 churches that didn't call me up north because I'm not white. Others told stories about being followed around in a store because they were black, and black people are expected to be shoplifters. It's a common experience. Even my family has experienced that. Many of our white friends and people in that group said, don't take things to heart. It was probably nothing and innocent. Even the woke people, as we use that term now, told this pastor, just take things at face value, pastor. Don't read too much into it. When you've been around a bit and have had these kinds of incidents happen to you in your life or the lives of others that you know, then whether you are black, whether you are white, or whether you are brown, you stop taking things at face value, right? Now, if you see these things happen over and over again in our society and continue to take these things at face value, not believing there is something ugly, something unjust and sinful under that face value, then you are in denial. Worse, you are denying the reality of this sin. Earlier in the narrative that we have from Luke 9, before this text, Jesus asked the disciples, "Whom do people say I am?" And they said, well, some say Elijah, and some say, some of the other prophets that have come back to life. Then Jesus turned to them and said, "Whom do you say that I am?" You remember that really famous acclamation, confession by Peter. He said, "You are the Christ, the Messiah of God." Peter was, for a change, woke. But look what happens in that narrative as it says, 8 days later. Only 8 days later. It's interesting that Luke makes that point. 8 days later. Peter seems to have forgotten. He retrogressed in his understanding. And he wasn't so woke anymore in his understanding of who Jesus is and was. He slipped back into characterizing Jesus as less than who Jesus is, equal to the prophets, or the bringers, the harbingers of the gospel in the law, like Moses was. And some of you might be confused, but stay with me and stay with the text. Today is Transfiguration Sunday. In today's text, Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus on what we call now the unnamed mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter wants to put up 3 dwelling places, 3 shelters, 3 sort of monuments in today's language. One for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. Now some might say, well, good on Peter, good for him. Respecting the prophets, the messengers of God who brought the law. That's what Elijah and Moses represented. He was protecting the law and the prophets, as it's also always called. Have you wondered why the sentence followed? That Peter did not know what he was saying. Mark's narrative of the same incident says Peter was babbling because he was terrified. You know, when you caught off guard with something that's awesome, you babble. Happens to you, right? It happens to me. When Peter was caught off guard by what was happening before him, he forgot that Jesus was not like Moses or Elijah. That Jesus is beyond the prophets and the lawgivers. You don't treat Jesus the same way as you treat Moses and Elijah, who are dead. Jesus is alive. And Peter will come to know that Jesus cannot die. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God incarnate. Not the reincarnation of Moses and Elijah, but God incarnate. In a flash, Peter miscategorizes Jesus. Interesting what happens immediately. God the Father steps in, boom! And we hear this loud voice in a cloud, because God covered them with a cloud. And it seems like Jesus said this, for goodness sake, Peter, this is my son. I don't know if he would have said, damn you. He's told you that, and in fact, I have told you that in his baptism. You just confessed this 8 days ago. He's the Messiah. My son came down to you. Listen to him already. Like Peter, we too misstep. We too stumble. We too babble. Especially when life situations catch us off guard. We just need to admit that we slipped up. We should know better when we are in a jam, in a pickle, not able to control the narrative of life. But often we become ignorant again. Suppose that's the way we are wired, because we lose control, and so we default to what's deep down, what we're still working on. That applies to how we throw other human beings under the bus. It applies to how we throw Jesus under the bus. when the situation arises. Some examples of that. When someone from another religion tells us that they believe in Jesus as a prophet too, and asks you, so why can't you accept that we have the truth too? We believe in Jesus. He's a prophet, like our prophets. When we hear this, we see it as profound and eloquently described in the court of God by this philosophy of life, and then we agree with their interpretation of our beliefs and accept their truth as similar to ours, even though they define Jesus as similar to, from the text, Elijah. We too minimize Jesus. Maybe someone else tells us that Jesus is simply here to explain the law. In other words, that Jesus is like Moses. They don't dismiss Jesus. They tell you that you and them are similar in the way they see the world. Our scriptures are your scriptures, they say. And as they say it in the eloquence and arguments, we sometimes lose our way and our truth is stymied. Once again, mischaracterizing Jesus. No, minimizing Jesus. That's more serious. So, let's not say, give the other person the benefit of the doubt, or see things at face value. Peter minimizes Jesus, and that was not the only time. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, when they were not so woke and sleeping. When the guards came to arrest Jesus, Peter, like a good person, takes out his sword and strikes the guard, cutting off his ear. Peter was actually minimizing Jesus, because Jesus said, put your sword away. He took the ear in some narratives and put it back, and he says, remember, if I wanted to call thousands of soldiers, angels, to protect me, I would just call them. In other words, stop minimizing me. I'm not your rabbi or your teacher. I'm the Son of God. The Messiah is here. It's subtle, but it was what Peter's actions were interpreted as in that narrative. Not my words, it's there. Peter denies his own confession of Jesus being the Christ when suddenly something stepped into his life that made him panic. And you know, later on he denied Jesus 3 more times, if not more. The thing that goes beyond human comprehension is that Jesus still forgives Peter. He will, and he does, forgive us too when we deny. He did more than that. He gave Peter a role in the kingdom that would draw other people who are equally weak and limping along to come to him. Take care of my sheep, my lambs, my flock. Yes, when we forget that we have a Savior in Jesus, when we try to do our lives on our own, forgetting that Jesus is Lord of our lives, we too minimize Jesus. I do that. Do you find yourself doing that? Nothing can get between us. If we confess before God, He will forgive us. Then when we are forgiven by God's promise, we dust ourselves off and keep on trying to do better. That is what my friend wanted. That is what we all wanted in that table when we told our stories to our colleagues. Admit that there's something wrong, even with us. Ask for forgiveness, dust yourself off, and ask God to help us live right. When people of color point out that we are not treated as we should be, let's not minimize them by saying, don't overthink your experiences. Let's not make excuses for offenders, even for ourselves, and cover up our sin. Whether it's about race or whether it is about us accepting truth where there is no truth, religious or otherwise. When we confess our sin, our compliance with sin, God can and will make us new. It's a promise of God. That new is that beloved community that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about, dreamt about, the beloved community. And Christ will take His rightful place in our lives as King. It's ours to have. Amen.